This is another podcast from Alpha Business Media. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on a truly fascinating deep dive into Nepal's bold experiment with inclusivity. We've got some really interesting analysis here, looking into their ambitious journey to redefine social equality. Our mission today is to explore whether Nepal's constitutional design has genuinely redistributed power, or if, maybe surprisingly, it's led to a more nuanced form of symbolic politics, where the numbers don't quite tell the full story.
And I think to really appreciate this, we have to grasp Nepal's starting point. I mean, after a decade of pretty devastating civil conflict, the country adopted a new constitution in 2015.
Right.
This wasn't just a political reshuffle. It was a direct response to centuries of really deep-rooted social inequalities.
Yeah.
Ingrained through caste, ethnicity, gender.
These long-standing issues.
Exactly. The overarching goal was, and this is their wording, to build an egalitarian society based on the principles of proportional inclusion and active participation. It's quite literally a massive social experiment, and what's particularly compelling is how they tried to legislate such profound societal change.
So how did they actually approach building this new framework then? What were the key elements in this legal design?
Well, the 2015 Constitution really is the absolute bedrock of this whole transformation. It doesn't just mention inclusiveness. It properly enshrines it as a fundamental principle across the entire state structure.
Okay.
There are several articles that really stand out. For example, Article 38.4 explicitly grants women the right to participate in all state bodies based on the principle of proportional inclusiveness. This became the direct legal basis for introducing gender quotas, at every level of government.
So this wasn't just a suggestion, it was a direct constitutional mandate for women's participation.
Precisely. A mandate. And Article 42 takes that principle even further. It guarantees the right to participate in public structures for a whole range of groups. Socially backward women, Dalits, indigenous peoples, Adivasi Janajati, Madhesi, Tharas, minorities, and other vulnerable communities.
A broad sweep.
Very broad. And then Article 70 adds another layer, requiring representation of each gender or community in the election of the president and vice president. These constitutional norms were a very deliberate legislative attempt to dismantle the historical monopoly on political and economic power held by what's known as the Caste Hill Hindu elite, or CHE.
Right, the CHHE group.
Which had persisted for centuries. This was a direct challenge.
That's a powerful legislative intent to directly tackle such entrenched power structures. But how did these principles then translate into practical mechanisms? How did they move beyond just the text?
Yeah, that's where Nepal's mixed electoral model becomes so crucial. It combines the first past the post, or FPTP system, where you vote for a specific candidate in your district.
The one we're familiar with in many places.
Right. And it combines that with proportional representation, or PR, where you vote for party lists. Now, the PR component was specifically designed as the main tool for ensuring marginalized group representation.
Okay, so PR was the key mechanism for inclusion.
That's where the legislative quotas really come into play.
And these quotas go quite deep, don't they? It's not just a general directive.
Oh, they are very specific. For instance, the law mandates a 33% quota for women. At least 1/3 of seats in both the federal parliament and provincial assemblies must be held by women.
Must be. Right.
And if the majoritarian FPTP system doesn't hit this target, parties are legally obliged to fill in the missing numbers from their PR lists.
So there's a backstop.
Exactly.
Right.
But arguably, even more revolutionary are the local level quotas introduced by the Local Elections Act of 2017. In each of Nepal's 6,742 wards. Think about that number.
Wow, that's specific.
The 5-member local committee must include 2 women, one of whom must be from the Dalit community.
One must be Dalit.
Yes. That truly represents a ground-up approach to inclusion. It wasn't just federal level.
That's incredibly prescriptive, right down to the local ward level. And did this extend to leadership positions too?
It did. The same law required political parties to nominate a woman for one of 2 key municipal positions, either mayor-head or deputy mayor, deputy head.
One or the other.
One or the other. Yeah. So this shows a clear, forceful mechanism for inclusion, a deliberate attempt to engineer diversity into the political fabric. So with such sweeping laws now in place, what did the initial numbers actually reveal? How did it look on paper?
Well, if we look purely at the quantitative data, the numbers themselves, Nepal's quota policy appears to have been, an unqualified success. There's been a dramatic, truly unprecedented increase in the presence of previously excluded groups in government bodies.
The figures genuinely speak for themselves. I mean, before these quotas, women's presence in the House of Representatives was minimal, less than 6% back in the 1990s. Tiny. But after the 2017 local elections, women occupied an incredible 40.9%. That's about 14,000 positions of all local government seats across the country.
14,000, that's
Yeah.
huge.
That was a historic breakthrough. At the federal level, the 33% quota was also largely met, making Nepal's parliament one of the most gender-balanced in Asia, and actually globally, too, largely thanks to that PR system compensating for fewer women elected in the FPTP districts.
Right, the PR system doing its job there. That's a profound shift in just a few years. But you mentioned another group that saw an even more significant change, perhaps.
Yes, I think perhaps the most impactful achievement of the system has been the unprecedented arrival of Dalit women into politics. This is one of the most historically oppressed and marginalized groups in Nepalese society.
Absolutely.
And their political presence was virtually non-existent before these changes. The mandatory quota for one Dalit woman's seat in each local committee resulted in 6,567 Dalit women being elected in 2017 and 6,620 in 2022.
Wow. Just from that one rule.
This single norm literally opened political doors for thousands. As a result, Dalit women now constitute a really significant share of all elected women representatives at the local level, about 47.4%, a direct consequence of this targeted quota.
So what's the larger takeaway from these numbers then? The quota system clearly drove this numerical revolution, solving the problem of absence for marginalized groups. They are visibly present in the political landscape in numbers never seen before. But, as we often see, quantity doesn't always equal quality, right?
This is precisely where we hit the core dilemma that the research really highlights. Is this real representation or merely formal observance?
Yeah.
The analysis shows that this impressive quantitative growth hasn't automatically translated into real power or, influence for these newly elected representatives.
Okay.
Traditional elites have largely managed to retain their control, and the new representatives often find themselves in roles that are, well, more symbolic than substantive.
So it's not just about getting bodies into seats, it's about what they do once they're there and who truly wields influence. Is this what's often called a glass ceiling in politics?
That's a very apt way to describe it, yeah. Data on the distribution of local positions reveals a worrying pattern. While women hold around 41% of all local positions, that big number we mentioned,
Right, the 41%.
their share in the most powerful non-quota roles like mayor or head of municipality is only 2%.
Just 2%.
2%. That's a stark contrast. However, in deputy mayor positions, which parties often allocate to women to meet the quotas?
Ah, or deputy mayor clause.
Exactly. Their share there reaches a staggering 91%. This clearly indicates that political parties use women and minorities to formally comply with the law, but they largely reserve the positions of true executive power for themselves, for the traditional players.
So the powerful leadership roles are still primarily preserved for the traditional elite.
Absolutely. The dominance of the cause aria elite, the traditional ruling class, remains strong. Men from this group, despite being only about 16% of the population, hold 48% of mayoral posts and 44% of district committee heads.
Almost half.
Yeah. This clearly illustrates a two-tiered system where powerful leadership roles are preserved for elite men, and less powerful quota-based deputy and committee positions are filled by women and minorities. It's a structural manifestation of tokenism, really. Inclusivity is demonstrated in secondary roles, while the core of decision-making remains largely unchanged.
This sounds like the quotas are opening the door, but maybe not necessarily giving them a seat at the main table. And it seems particularly acute for Dalit women, given their history of such significant historical oppression.
It truly is. For Dalit women, the quota has become both a ticket into politics and in some ways created new challenges. Their representation is almost entirely limited to that single mandatory local committee seat. Their presence in higher positions, like deputy mayor, is negligible.
So they're stuck in that one specific role.
Largely, yes. And once elected, they face enormous sociocultural barriers. Deeply rooted patriarchal and caste prejudices mean their voices are often ignored in meetings, they lack respect from male colleagues and sometimes the local community, and they're often excluded from the informal networks where the real decisions get made.
The old boys networked, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're frequently perceived as merely representatives of Dalit women, which kind of reduces their role to symbolics. So while the quota solved the problem of absence getting them in the door, It regrettably created a new problem of marginalized presence.
Marginalized presence, that's a powerful phrase.
It opens the door to the room, but it doesn't guarantee a voice at the negotiating table or that anyone will listen.
And it's not just about gender and caste, is it? What about other minority groups in Nepal? Is their inclusion also being challenged or undermined in some ways?
Unfortunately, yes. The proportional representation system, the PR system, which was initially designed to benefit minorities, is also being eroded somewhat.
Oh.
Well, increasing the share of first-past-the-post constituencies to 60% in parliament automatically reduces overall inclusiveness because FPTP historically favors dominant groups, those with established networks and resources.
Right, it's harder for smaller groups or newcomers.
Exactly. Moreover, and this is critical, the dominant Cause Arya group was even included in the list of groups eligible for quota reservations under the PR system.
Wait, the dominant group got quotas?
Yes, which critics argue fundamentally undermines the very principle of positive discrimination. It reduces the share available to historically oppressed communities.
That seems completely counterintuitive to the goal of inclusion.
It absolutely does, and you see the impact on the ground. Madhesi communities, for example, who live in the densely populated Terai Plains along the border with India. They feel their influence is deliberately undermined through gerrymandering, the redrawing of constituency boundaries. They argue that their territories are merged with sparsely populated hill areas, putting them at a significant disadvantage. They claim these changes aren't based on population, but geography, to dilute their vote.
Ah, rigging the map, essentially.
That's the accusation. And the appointment of a Madhesi president, while seemingly a positive step on the surface, is seen by many within that community as pure tokenism, given their extremely low representation in key state services like the army, police, and the civil service. The real power structures remain largely untouched.
It's clear the state has forcefully pushed for inclusivity in politics through these strict laws and quotas. But how does the private sector approach diversity in Nepal? Is it a similar landscape or a totally different story?
Oh, it's a stark contrast, a whole different world, really. Progress in the corporate sphere is much, much slower, and it seems to be governed more by market principles and, perceived business advantages rather than explicit social mandates or legal obligations.
So no strict mandates like the 33% gender quota we saw in politics. No equivalent.
That's right. Unlike politics, Nepal has no legally mandated quotas for women or ethnic minorities on corporate boards or in senior management positions. When you look at corporate governance legislation, like the Companies Act 2063, the focus is all on transparency, accountability, shareholder rights.
Standard corporate governance stuff.
Exactly. Gender diversity is merely mentioned as a best practice or maybe an aspirational goal, but it's not a legal obligation. This represents a fundamental philosophical gap, doesn't it? The state views inclusion as a right to be enforced by law, while the corporate world often sees it, if at all, as a potential business advantage to be encouraged, maybe for ESG points or something.
Yeah, that's a big difference in approach, and it leads to different outcomes, presumably.
Huge disparity in outcomes.
Are there any statistics on gender diversity in the corporate sphere, even without mandates? What does it look like?
Well, statistics are limited, but the available data paints a telling picture. According to a 2021 report, women make up about 29.6% of managers in Nepal. Now, that's a significant figure in itself, but still quite a distance from parity, with a 70.3% male managers.
Still a big gap at the management level.
A big gap, and look at the cooperative sector. Grassroots women's participation is high, 51%, but they hold only 13.2% of management positions.
Wow, that mirrors the politics situation almost exactly.
It's strikingly similar. High representation at the grassroots, but a sharp decline at decision-making levels. Now, international organizations like the IFC and UN Women are promoting gender equality in the private sector, highlighting direct economic benefits, like a potential 9.2% increase in Nepal's GDP with gender parity.
It's serious economic potential.
And research showing a positive correlation with ESG performance in banks. But this progress is slow, and it's market-driven or maybe donor-pushed, not policy-driven from within Nepal itself in the same way as politics.
This really underscores that political quotas, while crucial for opening doors, can only go so far without parallel economic and educational reforms, right? For communities like Dalits, are they even on the corporate radar in any meaningful way?
Honestly, for communities like Dalits, talking about corporate board seats feels almost surreal. The political inclusion provided by quotas simply hasn't addressed their fundamental economic exclusion, which makes participation in the corporate elite virtually impossible.
The barriers are just too high.
The statistics here are quite stark. Dalits, who make up about 13.8% of the country's population, have 42% living below the poverty line. 42%.
That's shocking.
Their average income is about half that of non-Dalits. Literacy rates are significantly low. Access to higher education is minimal. Only about 5% of Dalits are engaged in any kind of business at all.
Just 5%.
So, corporate leadership demands capital, education, social connections, all the things systemically denied to these communities for centuries. The pool of qualified Dalit candidates by traditional corporate standards is therefore tiny. The structures just aren't there to support their entry into that world.
This really brings home the multifaceted nature of true inclusion. Political quotas, while crucial, are clearly just one piece of a much larger, more complex puzzle that needs to be solved.
Indeed, Nepal's experiment with quotas has yielded mixed, but I think we have to say, highly significant results. It successfully changed the face of Nepalese politics, achieving a clear increase in descriptive representation. You see different people in the halls of power.
Right. The presence of women and Dalits in government is undeniable. That's a historic achievement that broke centuries of elite monopoly on political participation. However, as we've discussed, this promise remains only half fulfilled. The numbers mask these qualitative problems, as increased presence hasn't fully translated into equivalent substantive representation and real influence.
Exactly. The system has, in essence, created a visible but often symbolic layer of representation, where marginalized groups are concentrated in less influential, quota-based positions. Meanwhile, traditional elites retain control over the key levers of power.
Yeah.
This is particularly acute for those facing intersecting discrimination, like Dalit women, or for ethnic groups, such as the Madhesi, whose inclusion is undermined by ongoing political manipulation and structural barriers.
And in the corporate world, as we just heard, the journey towards inclusion has barely even begun. It's a field largely governed by market principles rather than social mandates, where deep economic and educational barriers for marginalized groups remain, well, virtually insurmountable at this point.
Ultimately, quotas have proven effective as a necessary first step, I think. They crack open a closed system. They are indispensable for initial access. But they are clearly not a panacea.
No silver bullet.
No. True representation requires much deeper transformations, challenging the patriarchal and caste norms that breed tokenism, reforming the internal structures of political parties themselves to promote genuine leaders from all backgrounds, and, perhaps most importantly, undertaking fundamental economic and educational reforms that create a truly level playing field. Without that foundation, quotas can only do so much.
Which really raises an important question for you, our listener. If quotas are simply the first step, what are those deeper systemic transformations needed for true representation, not just in politics, but across all spheres of society? And maybe what challenges might other countries considering similar paths need to be ready for, beyond just implementing the quotas themselves? Something to think about.